And good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. Hey, seen any more weather balloons lately flying over key strategic locations in America? Oh, just monitoring the weather there? Oh, never mind. Sorry. Oh, what a mess. Okay, now let's get back to Matthew chapter 25, 31, and following. What I've been sharing with you, ladies and gentlemen, is that Matthew 25, 31, and following is based upon not new covenant promises, divorced from, disjointed from the old covenant. But in fact, it was the anticipation of the fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel. Now, what does that mean? That means that until and unless Matthew chapter 25, 31, and following are fulfilled, it means that the entirety of the Old Covenant law remains valid today. It means that Israel remains God's covenant people today. Because Matthew chapter 25, 31, and following is the time of the final ingathering in fulfillment of Israel's Old Covenant feast days. It's Sukkot, the Feast of Ingathering. It is the harvest of the Old Covenant age. It's not the harvest of the Christian age. At the end of the Christian age has no end. Remember? So, once we understand, acknowledge, and admit that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is in fact the anticipation of the fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to Israel, then we can see without any doubt whatsoever that Matthew 25, 31 and following belongs with Matthew 25, 4 through 34. It's not a different coming of the Lord. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Matthew 24, 30 and 31. The coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of glory to gather the elect. Matthew 25, 31 and following, the coming of the Son of Man in glory to gather the elect, as well as, the nations. And yet we're supposed to believe that these are two radically dissimilar, radically disjointed, radically different events at two different times, separated so far by 2,000 years. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I used to believe that. I used to teach that. Until I came to realize it makes no sense. It just doesn't work. So, in demonstration of the fact that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is about the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, I've been sharing with you how the New Testament writers all tell us when they are writing about the issues, the themes, the motifs, the subjects, or the subject of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, they explicitly tell us that they're writing about the Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel that had to be fulfilled in order for salvation to flow in its fullest sense to all nations, to bring all nations into the salvation that God brought through Israel. By the way, I got to take this little sidebar here. Recently on Facebook, I was engaging with some of these Israel-only advocates, and a couple of different ones said, Preston, you just don't realize in Revelation chapter 21 and 22, this New Jerusalem has 12 gates named after the 12 apostles, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, only Israelites could enter into that city. Look, folks, you've never seen anyone so irresponsible, I would say dishonest, and illegitimate in their, quote, use or exegesis. It's not exegesis, it's eisegesis of the scriptures. So I responded, Well, based upon your logic, because a gate bore a certain name, the tribes of Israel, that means that only people in that tribe could enter there. Let's try that out. In the city of Jerusalem in Jesus' day, there was a gate called the Water Gate. That must mean only water could pass through there. Oh, wait, there was another gate that was called the Gate Beautiful, Acts chapter 3, remember? That must mean only beautiful people can enter that gate. There was another gate, sometimes called the Brass Gate. Well, that must mean that only brass could be carried through that gate. Or maybe people couldn't even enter the gate. Somehow, some way, brass had to enter by itself. On the northwest corner of the city of Jerusalem, there was a gate called the Essenes, Gate of the Essenes. That must mean that only the Essenes from out in the Dead Sea community, only they could enter. No, it's not what that meant. Other people could enter by that gate and leave by that gate if they so desired. It is just that the Essenes didn't like to use the other gates for purification purposes. Therefore, provision was made for them to enter that particular gate. Once again, it didn't mean that no one but Essenes could enter that. The illogic and the dishonesty of the Israel-only movement is just astounding. And by the way, I've not had one single Israel-only person to say one word in response to that argument. Okay, moving on. No one doubts, so far as I'm aware, there are a few people who, of the dispensational camp, generally speaking, who would deny that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is the same coming of the Lord, the day of the Lord of 2 Peter chapter 3. Now, dispensationalists normally, there are some who would differ, but dispensationalists normally place 2 Peter chapter 3 at the end of the millennium. Did you get that? At the end of the millennium. While the dispensationalists very often place Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following at the beginning of the millennium. Now, in the amillennial world, in the postmillennial world, that is not done. That the dispensational view is just categorically rejected, and rightly so. All right? I'm not going to go into a big dissertation on why the dispensational view is wrong, but there's just simply no merit to such a delineation between Matthew 25 and 2 Peter chapter 3. My point this morning, as it has been over the last little bit, is that if it is the case that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is the same coming of the Lord, day of the Lord, of 2 Peter chapter 3, then it means that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following was the anticipation of the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Therefore, unless Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, and unless 2 Peter chapter 3 is fulfilled, then God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel remain valid. Not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled. Oh, by the way, I had somebody tell me the other day that Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18 is the only argument I've got for the passing of the law. No. Sorry, folks. That's an argumentum ad desperatum. But let me move on. In 2 Peter chapter 3, what do we find about the source of Peter's day of the Lord? Well, let's see. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. Beloved, I now write unto you this second epistle, in both of which I stir up your holy minds by way of remembrance, that you would be mindful of the words which are spoken before by the holy prophets and of the commandments of us, the apostles of the Lord. Knowing this first, that scoffers shall come in the last days. Eschaton hemeron. The last days. You know, this is the last time of 1 Peter chapter 1 that we discussed yesterday, which was foretold by the prophets of the Old Covenant, who spoke of the coming salvation in the last day, at the day of the Lord. And we saw where that was predicted in the Old Testament. So notice here that Peter says, this is my second epistle that I'm writing to you to remind you of what the Old Testament prophets said. The prophets who have spoken before. Now, there's probably a handful of what we can classify as liberal scholars who say that Peter's not referring to the Old Testament prophets. Well, that won't work at all, ladies and gentlemen. Peter says, I'm reminding you of what the prophets who have spoken before have said, the prophets that I spoke about in my first epistle. Well, in the first epistle, he said the prophets spoke about the salvation that was coming in the last days, and those prophets knew it was revealed to them that not unto themselves did they minister the things of which they spoke, but to us, Peter said, who preached the gospel to you by the Holy Spirit sent down from God. So was Peter saying, you know, the prophets who came before me, they knew that the things that they were talking about weren't for them? Seriously? Was Peter saying none of the prophets that spoke before him, or maybe Paul or Matthew, whoever, they knew that what they were predicting was not for their day? Well, they lived at the same time that Peter did. Peter said those things were for him and his contemporaries. It is therefore utterly ridiculous. I'm sorry. It is utterly ridiculous to say, you know, the apostles who spoke before me knew that the salvation they were talking about wasn't for them. Peter's saying that he was the one to receive this salvation, but not the other apostles. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, this is utterly ridiculous. So here's the point. 2 Peter chapter 3. Peter said, I'm writing to you to remind you of what I said in the first epistle. What did Peter say in the first epistle? He said the Old Testament prophets spoke of the salvation that would come in the last days, in the last time. Oh, by the way, he also said in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5, Christ was ready, Greek word hitoimos, not only morally prepared, but temporally ready, eminently so, to judge the living and the dead. That's the resurrection. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. The end of all things has drawn near, in the perfect tense in the Greek, meaning the time has come. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 17. The appointed time, ho kairos, has come for the judgment. To krinon. Well, what did he mean by that? He meant that the appointed time for the judgment of the living and the dead had arrived. And you know, some former preterists, want to say, well, yeah, the time for the judgment of the living and dead, it's been present with us for 2,000 years. Now, you want to talk about some nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. What was far off in the Old Testament time to be revealed in the last days, that time of the judgment of the living and the dead, which is not an ongoing 2,000 or 2 million year process, that time for the judgment had arrived 2,000 years ago. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that when Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3, I'm writing to remind you of what I said in my first epistle. In my first epistle, I told you that the Old Testament prophets foretold the things that I'm writing about. And it was revealed to them it was not for their day, it's for our day. And that I said in the first epistle, Christ was ready to judge the living and the dead. That's the judgment of 2 Peter chapter 3. I told you in the first epistle that the end of all things, the earth and the elements therein that would be burned up, the time for that had arrived. And I told you in the first epistle, the appointed time for the judgment of the living and the dead, had arrived. So if 2 Peter 3 is the day of the Lord of Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, then guess what? Then that means, number one, it would be the fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to Israel. Point number two, Peter affirmed it was at hand, it was coming soon, it was coming quickly, it was coming shortly 2,000 years ago. And we got more from 2 Peter chapter 3, but we'll have to wait until next week. In the meantime, tomorrow we will continue our examination of the objections to my book, my brand new book, Temple to Telos. And we're going to be examining Luke 21:22. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you on the flip side.